in the words of Bill O'Reilly, fuck it, we'll do it live and hope for the best.
Okay.
What does that mean to play us off? I don't know what that means.
You better roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you're neither wrong or right.
Your party is now approaching the village of Hommlet. Having ridden up from the lands of the wild coast, you are poorly mounted, badly equipped, and have no large sums of cash. In fact, all you have is what you wear and what you ride, plus a few coins that are hidden in purses and pockets. What you do possess in quantity, though, is daring and a desire to become wealthy and famous. Thus, your group comes to Hommlet to learn if this is indeed a place for adventurers to seek their fortunes. You all hope, of course, to gain riches and make names for yourselves. What the outcomes of this will be is uncertain, but your skill and daring, along with a good measure of luck, will be the main ingredients of what follows, be it for will or woe. Welcome to another episode of Dungeon Master of None. I'm Dungeon Master Matt, and we are joined today by special returning guest, Andy. Andy, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks very much. That description you read sounds lame. Let's go to Barrier Peaks instead.
Hell yes. There are not enough lasers and robots in this adventure, but we are talking about Gary Gygax's classic module, T1, The Village of Hommlet, Introductory to Novice Level.
Excellent. One of my favorites. So glad you invited me on to talk about it.
We are happy to have you. Andy, how's your gaming been going? Anything you're excited about these days or absolutely loving or it's really, pissed you off?
Yeah, so I thought for sure COVID-19 was going to absolutely screw up my gaming life, but it turns out that I am doing more gaming than ever. Even though I am an old grognard, I have figured out how to do the kind of gaming I want to do using the tools available to me for remote play. And I've got several groups concurrently going in a kind of a sandboxy adventure. My game that I'm developing called Tales of the Iron League is going.
You're announcing it. That is a live Dungeon Master of None exclusive. Continue. Tales of the Iron League.
It's a game that's still in development, but the idea is that it's kind of emulates old school play for the benefit of the Houston Food Bank.
Excellent. A great charity and a great thing to do. If a listener, let's say, wrote to us at dmofnone@gmail.com and is like, I would love to try special guest Andy's Tales of the Iron League, is that a thing they could do?
You could point them to a link, which is ironleague.org, where the most current set of the playtest rules is up. It's not complete. It's not ready for prime time, but there's enough there that people can get a sense of what's going on.
Fuck yes. Andy, just for that, I am promoting you to Dungeon Master of None special OSR correspondent.
I'm a correspondent.
You are. Okay, let's get into this module. This is, in my opinion, I think this is embodies a lot of what is great, but also terrible about older Dungeons and Dragons modules. And I think it has a lot to teach us as dungeon masters, which is why we decided to do a whole episode talking about it. Andy, let's share our experiences with the Village of Hommlet.
Yes. So Village of Hommlet was one of those early TSR modules. I got started playing this game in 1980, and that was one of the modules that was available. And as it is the module that is most suited for beginner play, it got a lot of use. And so this was definitely a game that I have personally run in various incarnations and using various game systems probably 20 times.
Holy shit. Oh, you're blowing me out of the water here. I've run it twice.
Okay.
And I was like, I've run it more than once, which is, I think, more than I can say for really any other published module. 20 times. Holy shit.
I mean, I don't have an exact count, but that is my estimate. I think it's close.
It's canon now. It's on the show.
So let's specify that what we are talking about today is Dungeon Module T1, the Village of Hommlet. We are not, although we may touch on it later, we are not talking about the compilation adventure T1 through 4, the Temple of Elemental Evil, which includes a lot of the material from this adventure. We're going to talk about the primal initial adventure, the Village of Hommlet, 1979.
Exactly. We're not talking, except maybe at the end, Elemental Evil, Return to Elemental Evil, any of that other shit.
And those are good things to talk about, and we definitely should touch on them because they're worth a discussion. But I think that if you want to talk about encountering kind of one of these classics of grognardia in its most elemental form, you got to go back to the initial adventure and talk about that. So just sort of a little bit of background on this thing. In the late 70s, Gary Gygax and TSR were churning hard on their Advanced Dungeons and Dragons product line. They were working like a well-oiled machine to churn out the G and the D series of adventures. Those all came out in 1978. But I think there was a general recognition that, hey, wait a second, we've kind of jumped in with high-level stuff as our first adventures out of the box. Really need to be working on something that people can have starting characters and run through. And so I think with that in the back of his mind, Gary was always like, okay, that's got to be my next project. And therefore, we have The Village of Hommlet, which came out in 1979 in its initial incarnation. It was reprinted in 81 with different cover and artwork, but the content of it remained essentially the same. Gary had always envisioned the Village of Hommlet as being a module that, even though it was very different from the G's and the D's, that it was happening in the same world, that similar things were going on, and that somehow all these things would be tied together to indicate that it's all happening in this one shared World of Greyhawk setting.
This was the, putting together a Greyhawk cinematic universe.
Exactly.
We're talking divers, we're talking Verbubonk. It's all connected.
And in fact, we know this because sort of near the back of the adventure, he sort of hints that, too much spoilers is a bad thing, but he certainly hints at the idea that one of the big bads in the G and D series, the Demoness Lolth, is behind things in this adventure too. So it definitely always in Gary's head was all sort of tied together. Turned out that after this adventure came out, that Gary found himself kind of having a tough time writing. He wound up having to split his attention between this and many other products and things, and Gary had to continuously sort of go back and forth and juggle about a half dozen things at the same time. And as a result, Gary never wound up generating the sequel to this adventure that he really hoped would follow hard on its heels. We didn't get that sequel until 1985, much later on.
For those of you who have not read it, several times throughout this module, Gary Gygax is like, you'll find out more about this in the sequel.
Right.
And yeah.
And the sequel, as it turned out, I think is also kind of a classic of TSR adventuring, but it is, I think, nothing like the adventure that Gary had initially thought about for a variety of different reasons, one of which was he used up a lot of his good ideas and some of the other things that he was working on in between. And so he wound up teaming up with Frank Menser to come up with the sequel and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, we're getting away from the actual adventure itself, which I have a great deal of affection for. As you mentioned.
So do I.
As you mentioned, a lot to learn, some of them in a positive sense and some of the lessons in a negative sense.
Yes. I hope, listeners, that this episode will, whether or not you're interested in running this module, will provide you with some tips and advice for sort of planning out your own adventures or working with existed published material, because just like Andy said, it's a masterclass in what to do right and what to absolutely fucking not do. And before we get any farther in depth, right, for people who might play at it or who don't want any spoilers, I want to do two things. First, answer the question, is this a good module? And specifically, is it a good module for new players?
Okay, I'm going to answer it by cheating. I'm going to say it's half of a good module. This module is a great background. It is a module that a good DM can pick up, flesh out, and turn into a great module. But if it is just run as it is, black letter text, I think there's a real potential that a lot of your listeners are going to get bored.
Yes. Especially if you're familiar with like any module published in, let's say, the last 20 years, which kind of walks you through things. This one does not. However, I kind of agree with Andy here. It's basically, if you want to spend, I don't know, I want to say like 8 hours sitting down with this module and adding your own stuff and planning and plotting things out. We'll get into the specifics later. I think it's a great module for new players.
Right. So, I mean, let's just talk about the structure of this adventure.
What are you getting?
You read the starting description, in which basically neophyte adventurers travel a long ways and come to a place called the Village of Hommlet. And they have more detail in other areas of the intro, but it basically says, not long ago, maybe 10 years ago, this area of Greyhawk was a very dangerous and fraught place where mighty forces, evil and good, were fighting with each other over kind of the control of the heartlands of this World of Greyhawk area. And ultimately, evil lost, that the good guys drove away the bad guys, put them to the sword or otherwise disposed of them. And then suddenly the land was at peace. And that was true for a decade or more. And yet recently in the now peaceful area of Village of Hommlet, which has grown prosperously, there are now whispers and rumors that maybe bad things are afoot, that brigands are haunting the lands, and that adventurers would return to this area to seek glory by fighting monsters and taking their stuff.
Imagine that you just said that in like Kate Blanchett's dulcet tones at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings. And yeah, it's that kind of setup.
Yeah, if I could do that, I wouldn't be on your podcast.
No, you'd be on a better podcast.
That's right.
So that's like the kind of background information. And again, without getting into too much detail, which we'll get into later in our kind of spoilers section, this module gives you a ton of details about a village rife with intrigue and a 2-part dungeon. And that's pretty much it. It's a pretty straightforward on the surface setup.
Yes. I think if you see the act of adventuring in a Dungeons and Dragons module as essentially fishing in a stocked pond, where the pond is stocked with monsters, and fishing means you go from place to place in it and kill them and take their stuff, then this is the dungeon for you. Now, it's not quite that simple, because he does give you a lot of kind of tantalizing hooks and tidbits and backstory.
So much tantalizing. Gary Gygax is the ultimate tease.
Right. He doesn't go into a huge amount of detail on any of it, but at least he throws it out there. And I actually like that. I feel like adventures sometimes lead DMs by the nose a little too much. And sometimes the real magic is to be found in that place where the DM takes the hook and develops it in their own direction. And so that part of it I don't necessarily object to. I think the part of it that starts to get a little iffy is there's really no there. There is no overarching story. There is pretty much just, okay, here's a bunch of monsters and a bunch of settings, go forth and kill things. And it is up to the DM to then take that and potentially add to it and make it into something that has a little more interest for the modern audience.
Yes. I think if we're getting to the question of should you continue listening to the show for the Dungeon Master tips alone, but to consider running the module, what are the reasons you should consider running it? And what are the reasons maybe this isn't for you and you should just glean this episode for your own Dungeon Master advice? I think one reason you should consider running this is because if you have the type of group or you want to run the type of game where there's a ton of plot hooks and then you develop the ones that your players are interested in, maybe without completely knowing what they might turn into, I think this is a great module for that.
So let's expand on that. I think one of the things that Village of Hommlet does better than any other adventure since is that it has created the Platonic ideal of a starting town.
Yes.
The Village of Hommlet itself and the descriptions associated with it and the material they present within it are so perfect that I can't froth enough about it. But I will.
If you want to learn how to make a town, or even just in more general, like a node for adventuring, reading this and hopefully listening to our assessment of it is I think exactly what you need to do as a dungeon master. It's great.
So let me touch on that briefly with an incredibly huge detour into something unrelated.
Hell yeah.
I wish to make a metaphor involving comics.
Okay.
And specifically, I'm going to talk about the Bottle City of Candor.
Your greatest failure, Superman.
Where is he going with this, you ask? Well, in the 50s, Action Comics 242, plot develops. Superman's old foe, Brainiac, is up to his usual evil. He's been going around and shrinking cities. And it turns out that one of the cities that he shrank was Candor, the capital city of the planet Krypton, before the planet exploded. And so he's got it shrunk in this bottle, the Bottle City of Candor. So as it develops, Superman fights Brainiac, defeats him, rounds up all the cities. It turns out that Brainiac has I forget what it's called, like a unshrinking ray or something like that. And Superman uses the unshrinking ray on all the other cities, but saves Candor for last. And when he goes to unshrink it, he's out of juice. The ray isn't working anymore. So it's stuck in bottle form. So Superman takes it back with him to the Fortress of Solitude and says, well, maybe someday I'll restore them to their full size. What follows is a good decade or more of stories involving the Bottle City of Candor, and the fans eat it up. They love that a little bit of backstory is provided regarding Krypton and Kryptonian life, because up to that point, it had been extremely throwaway and abstracted, and they really hadn't touched on any specifics. But now Superman is actually going into the Bottle City of Candor and interacting with people, and people get to see, hey, this is what Krypton was like, and it's pretty amazing. But here's
there's Russell Crowe's there. I remember. Yeah.
Okay, but here's the amazing thing: so many artists, so many people worked on it, but there really wasn't a whole lot of consistency on it. They never drew the skyline of Candor the same way twice. And so this Bottle City had a few things that were consistent, but the rest of it was all artistic expansion and enhancing of the seeds that had been left behind. And the reason I gave you this metaphor is this is why Hommlet is so great. Hommlet gives you little tastes of very specific things. For instance, there's an inn in town. I don't think it's a big spoiler to say the inn is called the Inn of the Welcome Wench. And they go to the level of telling you what the menu is and how much things cost. They give you a lot of detail in the town of specific big important buildings like the local temple and the local defensive castle / tower, even though it's unlikely you'll actually go and adventure there. And they spell out a lot of detail on these things. And yet, a lot of other things they really don't spell out. They don't necessarily give you the names of people other than a few individuals here and there.
There are so many unnamed NPCs, which we will get into, but yes.
Right. So they leave a whole lot of information as kind of a blank sheet of paper for the DMs to come and fill out on their own. And I think that's great. They have, like the Bottle City of Candor, left it such that each time you can reinvent it. And, you know, when people are playing in games like this, they aren't expecting a super accurate travel log. No one cares about that. If the details of the town are a little bit different every time you come and go, maybe that's okay, especially if that leads you to a place of creativity and a place where everyone can kind of interact around the city. And so I love the fact that Hommlet combines the really specific stuff with the really vague stuff in such a great, seamless, organic way to create a setting for people to start off their first few sessions of this game by just kind of getting a feel for the land and talking to people and learning new things about the area in a way that isn't just absolutely nailed down for you. So I think that's one of the great things about this adventure, that this adventure does better than any other adventure, is that wholesome mix between the very specific and the very vague.
It's almost like this is an adventure where every dungeon master can come in and leave their mark on it, play it in a completely different way than the one before. It's almost kind of like a rite of passage. Not that we need those in Dungeons and Dragons, but if you want it, it's there.
Right. And
it's like that artist coming in to draw Candor in their own way. This is a module that you can play and run in your way. Just try it. We're encouraging you to try it.
And that's super helpful because if, as we talked about earlier, if you aren't going to play this just as a game where you are shooting fish in a barrel, if you are instead, as a dungeon master, going to incorporate your own story and weave it into the background of the setting, those holes in the information they give you plenty of creative room and agency for you to fill in those gaps. And that's something that I don't know if that's what Gary intended when he originally wrote it the way he did, but he certainly made it useful for people who want to customize adventures with their own stories by doing it the way he did.
And I think this is the perfect point to take a turn in the episode and tell listeners that in just a second, we're going to be getting into some spoilers in the module. But before we do, if there's anyone who's like, well, I know my, dungeon master might want to run this very soon. I'm not a dungeon master. That's fine. Is there any sort of things that we can talk about before we get into specifics? That's like, there are certain types of dungeon masters where this module is probably not for you.
Yeah, I think this module is probably not for DMs who want to run a game that doesn't really involve a whole lot of the classical exploring ruins and fighting monsters, because that's not the only type of game, of course. And there are many types of games that involve more kind of cooperative problem solving and helping people come to consensus. And there's all sorts of other adventures that those kinds of adventures don't necessarily work very well with this kind of setting. This setting is pretty much about going to a place and fighting stuff there. And if that's not at least an important part of your adventure style, then you may want to look elsewhere. But with the precondition that you are kind of locked in to the classical dungeoneering sort of style of play, I think that this can be made to work for just about any DM.
Yes. And that siren in the background was your warning that we are getting into the spoilers and actual details of the module. So if you don't want to know the specifics of this module, see you later. Thanks for listening. Andy, your point is a good one, because the theme of this module is so strong. If you ask a person who only knows they've only heard of Dungeons and Dragons, but they've heard a little bit about it, and they tried to describe to you what Dungeons and Dragons is, this module has the things that they would come up with, right? an inn where the adventurers meet, right? A little bit of intrigue, creatures of pure evil, the dark gods, a literal dungeon.
Yes. In fact, all this is set up for you in the village description itself. As you say, they give you a gathering place, a natural gathering place in the form of this inn. They give you numerous people who have little bits of information, and maybe by going around and talking to them, you can glean a bigger picture. There are factions, hidden factions within the village who maybe don't have the adventurer's best interests at heart. And so these are kind of a hidden threat that as the adventure develops, that maybe you can expose. And
let's get into the specifics of the village. If you're listening, we hope you've got a copy of Village of Hommlet that you've referenced or looked at. It can still be bought in PDF form through the DMsGuild, or there are plenty of used copies that you can find or elsewhere. The village itself, right, is presented in a way that I think if you're used to normal modules is very different. It goes building by building through the village, and then with special attention paid to 3 spots, right? The Inn of the Welcome Wench, the traders in the village, the Church of St. Cuthbert, and then Byrne and Rufus's castle. So where do we want to start with it?
so, I mean, let's start with the Inn of the Welcome Wench.
We love the inn.
As mentioned earlier, it's very, very specific as far as kind of the niggly little details of, what can I drink? What can I eat? Can I stay there? Can I get a room? Yes. The answer to these questions is yes. There is plentiful detail for you to figure out how to do that. But
when I was running this for my high school students, I decided I had to rename this the Dragon's Head Inn, and there was a dragon head over the fireplace because I didn't want to use the word winch. But yes, it's a great inn.
It is a fine inn. I would say also that they mention some of the non-player characters who you are likely to encounter when you go to this inn. And that can be a very useful thing too, when you are, especially if you're a starting dungeon master and you're like trying to piece together on the fly what people encounter when they walk into a inn. This module does a lot of the heavy lifting for you and helps you develop these things on the fly for you to spoon out to your characters.
Absolutely. If you want to start a game where, the players, you read them, the description of arriving to Hommlet, and then they go to the inn for a warm meal after a terrible long journey. If you want to play a game where you're introducing new players to the game, this module starts in a tavern, right? It's great for that. And we get, Furnock of Ferd. We get all these fun little NPCs for them to, right off the bat, after they've introduced their characters to each other, interact with.
Right. And what's important is that some of them are just fun to interact with. Some of them are really important to interact with because it turns out that when you get deeper into the adventure, things get very dangerous. And that having the assistance of higher level, better equipped non-player characters is something of tremendous use and importance for the survival of the party. And we'll get more into that in a second. But at the Inn of the Welcome Wench, you can make the introduction of a number of those people, which is sometimes a good thing and sometimes a bad thing. Let me tell you about one of the bad things.
Do it.
One of the non-player characters is kind of a plant planted by the good guys, a guy named Elmo.
Oh, we love Elmo, don't we?
Elmo pretends to be just kind of a dumb man-at-arms who's willing to hire on for a share of the treasure and is willing to go and fight evil. And if you need help, he'll help you out. In reality, Elmo is actually a very competent fellow who's probably higher level than any of the characters will actually achieve during this adventure. That's good if the characters get like in over their heads in danger. It's bad because really this adventure ought to be about what the characters do. If the characters get bailed out by high-level NPCs, are they really having a heroic adventure, or are they actually the sidekicks?
I think this is one of the many, many tweaks that most dungeon masters make to this module. In my own runnings, Elmo is maybe a level or two higher than the players, but he's not a 10th level ranger or whatever he is in this thing.
Right. And then going beyond the inn, there are other places where you can get assistance. For instance, you mentioned the Temple of St. Cuthbert. The temple is a place where there are a number of clerics who work there. Some of them are unlikely to be of immediate help and may just be kind of stern elders who scold people and attempt to get them to donate money. But some of them may be younger and more energetic and willing to adventure for a share of the treasure. You mentioned the castle of Byrne and Rufus, important political...
Our beautiful gay dads. We love them.
Yes, they are commonly seen by fandom as two close friends who may not just be platonically close, but they are also agents of the not very far away political authorities. And
this is the first Dungeons and Dragons ship, I think.
Okay.
I have no authority with which to prove that, but I'm going to say it's true.
I will not argue with you because I can't think of a counterexample right now. But the Byrne and Rufus, the occupants of the tower, are not expected to adventure with people. They're too important, but they may be helpful in other ways. They may be willing to supply information. They may be able to supply resources. Just depends on whether you get on the good side with them. And so there's definitely ample room for players, especially ingenious or thoughtful players, to figure out a way to maybe get assistance from the denizens of Hommlet for when they leave Hommlet to go and do dangerous things.
A couple examples here, Andy, that I think are important if you're interested in running this and sort of teaching yourself how to flesh things out, right? This is useful for a published module or your own idea where you're like, there's a temple of the gods in this place. And then how do you flesh that out from there, right? Gygax provides us like with a little bit of clues, but then it's kind of free reign to go from there. An example, with the Church of St. Cuthbert, we're given all of these wonderful examples of the sayings of the church, such as square corners can be pounded smooth. Thick heads are not made of glass, right? That give us the attitudes of the priests of this religion. Stern, practical, take no nonsense, but very much interested in eradicating supernatural evil. With Byrne, right, the most worshipful mage of Hommlet, right, we get that title, and we know that, maybe he's a little bit pompous, maybe he's a little bit full of himself. Fleshing out these NPCs is, I think, for me, one of the funnest parts of prepping this module.
Yes, and I think they give you lots of room to do that. As you mentioned, they give you these little hints, these little teasers about maybe this is who they are. But then they say, both Byrne and Rufus, or perhaps both of them, can be found at the Inn of the Welcome Wench drinking. And here's the percentage chance that they'll actually
That's great.
And so... they give you these little details, but then the rest of it is for you to fill in, and I think that's great.
If you were... I'm sorry, go ahead, Andy.
Well, I was about to get away from the helpful people and then get into the neutral people. You mentioned Furnock of Ferd. There are various NPCs who are not there to help, not there to
Hobart and Turok.
Yes. two other guests at the Inn of the Welcome Wench, who there are many guests at the Inn of the Welcome Wench. Some of them might be interested in adventuring. Some of them might be interested in adventuring because they want to rob the player characters and maybe pretend to adventure with them, but hang back from the trouble. And then when they're weakened, kind of polish them off and take their stuff. And that's a great kind of encounter to fill in some ways. In some ways, it's also a little worrying. If this is intended for brand new players, I can easily see them being taken in by a scheme like that and possibly turned off Dungeons and Dragons forever. Oh, great. The NPCs just kicked our asses. So I think that's something that DMs need to be careful with, they need to use sparingly. I'm not at all opposed to having sneaky bad guys lurking about, and certainly lack of trust is a great lesson for beginning players to learn. But I think that needs to be used sparingly.
Yes. Absolutely. For every, Furnock that wants to stab them in their back and take their stuff, or maybe that's more of Turok and Cobart. And people we haven't mentioned yet are traders. Was it Dahl and Gregnar, who are in fact secret agents of evil, right? The players need to encounter, Turgeon, who gives them, holy water for free because he, respects what they're trying to do and is willing to take a player and train them as a paladin, which is something that happened in one of my games.
Yeah, no, I believe that Grimag is the name of
Grimag. Thank you. Yes,
one of the traders. I can't
remember.
The
names that we are given are just very Gygaxian.
Yes, absolutely. But the traders are secret spies for sort of enemy evil organizations that were put down 10 years ago, but are starting to rise again in the countryside. And their organization is touched on more in the sequel to Village of Hommlet. But here they're just kind of presented as guys who pose as helpful traders. And maybe if the party starts to do bad things for their conspiracy, then maybe they will take direct or indirect action to try and stop them. But they're sort of intended to remain hidden. I think in the best possible play, they are only revealed after considerable investigation and maybe them showing their hand prematurely or something like that.
Yeah, they're kind of in the background. They're very much, it's very difficult for players, and I think this is a positive in their first kind of, let's say, walk through the village, through this node. There's only a very small chance that they would ever suspect that these two traders, a courier that comes to town to visit them sometimes, and one of the laborers on the castle are in fact spies for this temple of elemental evil.
Yes. And in fact, there are a number of bad people, and they leave the possibility open for there to be more bad people. For instance, kind of at the conclusion to the adventure, they say, well, if the good guys are completely successful in going over to the adventuring area and killing the main big bad guy there, it's possible that the traders will facilitate this assassin visiting the town and trying to kill them off. And so he really kind of gives you the possibility for a development.
It's a lesson learned. Never brag about something to someone who could inform the demoness Lulth.
Right. Yes, that is definitely true.
Beyond just the evil factions, and this is, in fact, I think, my favorite part of the whole adventure. I think it's a thing that after you read through the village section once, and we have to mention, this can be kind of hard because it seems like a lot of the chapter is taken up by description of farmhouse after farmhouse. And this is, I think, unlike, let's say, the last module we did a deep dive on the show, The Lost Mines of Phandelver. Every single person who lives in this village isn't named, but they are listed, right? every farmer, the leather worker, the village elders, they're all listed out. And so reading through the village can be a little bit boring, and the module never sort of comes out and says this, but almost everyone, with just a few exceptions in the village, is either a follower of this new religion, the Church of St. Cuthbert, or part of the old faith, Druidism, which is led by the local druid, Jeru Ashstaff.
Right. And they kind of go into detail on factions that later on in this shared world that TSR creates are dealt with in much more detail, but they're at least touched upon here. So, for instance, 1979, before we had a fully fleshed World of Greyhawk gazetteer sort of a thing, there are hints about the gnomes of the Cron Hills, of the elves that live to the south, of the druids of the gnarly forest.
Them gnarly druids.
Yes.
They're gnarly, man.
That live off to the east, and then the energetic Viscounty of Verbabonk that's off to the north and west. So there's all these details for this larger world that Gygax just sort of hints at, but then he does pretty neatly tie it all together when he develops the larger World of Greyhawk product.
Yes. And one of the fun things that I think this module is great at, we touched on earlier, I want to go into depth in it now, is that by giving you, there are more hooks than I think we can safely say that no campaign could truly explore all of these. But if your players latch on, oh, I'm really interested in this new faith that is spreading, St. Cuthbert, and we all want to work for the canoness Yade when she comes back because she seems like a badass. Or we're really interested in this conflict that's going on right here in our village between the new faith and the old faith, or the spies that the gnomes are sending over here, right? This is, I think, a perfect module to follow what your players are interested in.
Yes. For instance, in the town, there's sort of a throwaway NPC, I guess you'd call him. I think his name is Black Jay. He's kind of this shepherd who has sort of a sad story, in that he lost his wife and kids in the battle, 10 years ago or whatever. And he's he can be a source of information of, well, what happened here really so long ago, and lots of hooks and lots of ways to get involved, but all the hooks, most of the hooks all point you in the same direction, that a few miles outside of town to the east, that there's the remains of this old fortified structure called the Moat House. And this Moat House used to be a strong point of the forces of evil during that recent conflict, but it's largely ruined now, and it's been abandoned for a long time. But various hints and rumors and such are going to be, maybe it's not so abandoned after all. Maybe there's some activity in that area, and there's talk of bandits and brigands on the road that are robbing people, and gosh, they seem to all be coming from that same area. Maybe they're involved somehow. Maybe they're using the Moat House. And so, one way or another, people who knows about town and talk to different people are going to be nudged in the direction of this Moat House, which winds up being the focal point of the adventuring part of the adventure.
Yes. If you haven't picked it up from looking at it the first time through, right? There's no, unlike modern modules, there's no table of rumors and hooks, but through all of these characters fleshed out to one degree or another, there is something that could eventually point the characters in the direction, oh, hey, you want to get wealthy? You want to be an adventurer? Here's where you should start.
Right. And so here is where I need to touch on something, by the way. You mentioned earlier, one of the ways you can get hold of this adventure is you can buy used copies. So the copy that I own is from the 79 initial printing. And the art in it was done by Dave Trampier, who is one of the great stable of fantasy artists used by TSR in their heyday. Dave Trampier contributed 6 pieces of art to this module. 3 of them are just kind of scenes about town in Hommlet. That's great. One of them is a very generic, just kind of scene of rats, which is important because you'll learn the rats in the adventure. One of them is a terrific piece. It's sort of a perspective piece of this moat house, what you see when you approach it. And it's one of the single most useful, I think, pieces of art that's ever been included in an adventure because it's almost photorealistic and it really gives people the sense of what things are like at the moat house.
Yes. I had the advantage of last time I ran this, I had a PowerPoint projector behind me and I was able to click a button on my mouse and then there for this entire section of the adventure, there's the picture of the moat house. And It's incredible. You need a copy of this to hand to your players.
But I mention this in order that I can mention that the last piece of art, which happens to be the piece of art that goes on the front cover of the module and therefore is visible to the players if you are using the map as a stand-up, is the biggest fucking spoiler you've ever seen. That basically it tells you who all the bad guys are in the adventure. And I think there's a good reason why they went away from that for the second printing in 1981. It pretty much tells the tale of who the bad guys are and many of the things that you will encounter when you go in this adventure. So my caution to you is if you are in fact going to buy an old copy of the adventure, maybe you want to cover that front cover up just so that people don't get the wrong idea or show it to them later. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And the moat house is, I think, a really interesting dungeon, right? Because just for people who are not looking at this, the moat house has this upper level and then a very kind of hidden under level where the plot kind of continues. But let's start, I guess, with this upper level of the moat house, this ruin that the players up until this point probably only know bad things or bad people are coming from here.
Yes. So I love the upper works. I think the upper works are much superior to the lower works as far as I'm concerned, as far as quality of adventuring play. And I love it for a variety of reasons.
Can we talk about frogs, Andy? Can we talk about the frogs?
Well, let's start by talking about frogs.
Let's talk about the frogs.
One of the first encounters is that the moat house is located in this swampy, low-lying region. And the first numbered encounter is an encounter with giant frogs. And I have to say, maybe 30% of the times I have run this, particularly with small parties, that first encounter has been incredibly deadly.
Absolutely. Let's see, 100% of the times I have run this, because I've only run it twice, either a player or a beloved horse has died.
Beloved horse. That's great.
Yes.
Well,
Chompers, no.
So certainly it is an incredibly dangerous encounter, and it's not the only one of those dangerous encounters. You will find that in this upper works, there is a wide variety of encounters, ranging from the relatively manageable for a first level party to a, wow, we had better plan ahead before we tackle this kind of an encounter. But that's good. That's not a bad thing. And
no, it's not.
This is an introductory adventure. It is specifically intended, it says right there on the front cover, that this is introductory to novice levels. It's intended for starting not just characters, but also potentially players. And one of the most important things about an introductory adventure is that it should be a good schoolhouse for learning important D&D things. For instance, don't split the party unless you can't help it. Scout out things and gather information. Look for secret doors. Be stealthy when you can. These are all things that are great lessons to learn and are applicable and greatly increase your survivability in just about any adventure you go on. And
we've gotten a couple letters, Andy, of dungeon masters saying, like, my players don't really know how to like, plan ahead or do the scouting type things or look for things. And this is a section of an adventure that will, through violence, teach your players how to do those things.
Right.
I have a question for you, Andy. Of the many times you've run it, how many times have the players, I think this is a great lesson for dungeon masters too, not gone in through the apparent entrance? There's a rotting drawbridge, but of course there's also a secret passage of a collapsed wall. That's how the bandits are getting in and out and kind of avoiding the most obvious monsters, which is, again, an important lesson for dungeon masters. Like, if you have something like bandits or something in a thing, how are they avoiding the monsters? And so I'm curious about that.
Well, so the vast majority of the times that I've run it, they've gone in through the front door, and at least in part, that's because that great piece of art that I mentioned earlier, that piece of art very clearly shows here's the main entrance and here's how you get across it. And people say, oh, there's like this ruined drawbridge, and that's interesting. I'm going to explore that. The few times when people have gone a different way has generally been older, more seasoned players. Once I ran it for people online who I didn't know, and I said, I really don't care if you know the adventure. Our goal is to have fun with this and play your characters, even if you know the setting. And so those were, of course, people who knew the setting and the adventure intimately. And sure, they amazingly thought up the scheme of we're going to go in the back. But they did it in a clever way, and that made me happy.
A digression that I think illustrates this point. In one of my run-throughs, the player characters got very interested in the fact that commerce was being disrupted and people were getting robbed, above the fact that, people are being like, well, there's this ruin here. And they're like, no, we need to handle this. And they track the bandits down. They set up, I was very proud of them. They were very new players, set up a clever ambush for the bandits, fight some of them, and track one of them back to the general area of the moat house. Of course, then I showed them the picture, and they're like, oh, well, even though we don't see any tracks, we're going to go over the drawbridge. They discovered the bandits' lair, which is in the rear of this moat house. And then they discovered the bandits' secret passage. And they all learned, and through the rest of our time playing together, it was sadly cut short by COVID, that, there can be secret passages. So when Andy and I talk about this as like a teaching module, both for players and dungeon masters, like if you want to teach your players through play to look for secret passages, this is how, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. That, in fact, the secret passage that I'm thinking about is one that allows the players to shortcut some fairly dangerous encounters at lower level. And so that it's absolutely a linear connection between learning this skill and improving your survivability.
Right. If they learn this skill and they put it into practice and, maybe get lucky too, right, they can immediately reap the rewards, right? For example, one of the, and we've got a lot more to cover here, but one more thing I want to highlight is there's a lot of giant bugs and other shit in here. There's a ton of, I feel like this module is mostly like giant monsters, right? Giant versions of regular monsters, giant frogs, giant snakes, giants, crawfish, and giant spiders.
Don't forget a tick.
There's a giant, oh God, the fucking tick. And a snake, sorry. The first giant monster players are likely to encounter, the one right next to the entrance to in a tower next to the door into the moat house, has it taught one of my groups, this was the other group, to sort of try and discuss and draw connections from things they observe, which is really a learned skill in Dungeons & Dragons that's really applicable to any type of play. When players enter this half-collapsed tower, they see a corpse that is kind of a dried up, desiccated husk, right? It's died unusually. If they maybe take a second to discuss, well, what could have done this, and decide, oh, maybe something in here killed it. And now for people who've played a lot, you might be like, oh, that's fucking obvious. But for new players, it really isn't, right? And they learn, oh, maybe there's a monster in here. We should be cautious.
Right. I think another thing that's very helpful from a teaching standpoint is that, at least as far as the upper works goes, it's not an aggressive dungeon. So what do I mean by that?
Ooh, this is a great point, Andy. God damn it, this is so good.
There are plenty of adventures where you go into that adventuring area and it's full of people who respond to your invasion and come and get you. If you are discovered, maybe they raise an alarm, maybe they bring in reinforcements from different points, and that can be very, very deadly for new players who are just kind of learning the ropes of how to adventure. But the upper works, as you say, are mostly kind of these scattered giant monsters, and the players can kind of take it one encounter at a time. And even if they have problems in that encounter and someone gets hurt or, God help you, killed, then you can patch them up, you can go back, you can rest, you can come back later on and explore other parts, and the entire environment isn't working against you. That's very important for a teaching type thing, because it's more forgiving of you learning these lessons on the fly. And I think that's very different when you go down into the lower works, and we'll talk about that in a second.
And I think the other thing, and I actually, without looking it up, can't remember if this is in my own version or in the actual module, right, is this is a great opportunity to learn how to leave clues in a dungeon that help further the plot. Something like, a letter or a payment or a special thing that the only intelligent creatures in the top part of the dungeon are these bandits, right? And you can leave a clue that maybe these bandits are receiving some kind of support from someone else, whether that's the crooked merchants in town or someone deeper in the dungeon.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there is that stuff that you mostly have to incorporate as a DM. That's mostly not something that's written into the adventure. There's only limited clues that are actually seeded throughout there, but it's a relatively easy drop-in thing for a DM to say, oh, and by the way, the brigands had this letter or something like that, or they have a brooch.
A brooch is a good one.
A particular design on it that you can ask questions about, maybe learn something about, right?
Here is why this is not just a teaching module for players, but for dungeon masters. If you're thinking about running this module, and Andy, feel free to disagree with me. Here's my advice for you: is take a blank sheet of paper, and in like little circles, like you're making a flow chart with no connections, lay out some of the important groups and people, or the ones you find most interesting. The brigands, the evil traders, the Church of St. Cuthbert, etc., and draw yourself some lines between those things and fill them in with something as simple as opposes this other group or receives funding or is in communication with, and it will help you plot out, turn this node into something that encourages players to continue exploring.
Yeah, that's a great idea for really any kind of environment, whether it's something like a town or something like a dungeon or other adventuring environment. In fact, bubble diagramming like that can be very useful for laying out the actual dungeon as well, where before you draw any kind of a map, you can create these logical bubbles that say, okay, I want this bubble to represent the ruined temple, and then adjacent to that I want there to be the quarters of the high priest, but also adjacent to it I want to be the cells where the sacrifices are kept. And then so you can kind of bubble diagram out a dungeon long before you actually draw any specific maps, so that you can establish those logical connections, which are the most important part for creating a whole that works.
Okay, Andy, let's go down a level, by which time your players, whatever edition you're using, should probably have gone up at least one level and into the ruins, or the dungeon below the ruins of the moat house.
Here's where one of my biggest criticisms comes in.
Yeah, this fucking sucks. I know what you're going to say.
The difference in danger level between the upper works and the lower works is extreme. the amount of experience points available, at least for first edition AD&D, I don't know to what extent it would be true for a 5e conversion, but the amount of experience points available in the upper works is not enough for a typical sized party to gain a level.
Oh, okay. Well, I was wrong there. In 5th edition, it should be. 5th edition has very low experience thresholds for the first 2 levels.
Great. And that's wonderful news. But I can tell you that, I don't know for a fact because you are more of a 5e guy than I am. But the difference in challenges between the first level and the second level are extreme, to the point where when I'm talking to people who are wanting to run this in its initial form using first edition AD&D or some other OSR product, I always recommend to them that they do one of 2 things. They either do the upper works and then find some other adventure to go on before they hit the lower works, or I tell them to start with some other introductory module so that they actually get some experience points, something like Saltmarsh, and then proceed on such that maybe the upper works are a little bit easier for them, but then they're able to hit the ground running in the lower works. That gap is a big downer for me and has resulted in the death of a lot of characters when I've run it, because they're like, oh, well, I guess things are going to maybe get a little more dangerous when we go downstairs. And then 15 minutes later, it's like, total party kill.
Yep. There's about 4 of those, maybe 6 in the lower works, and players are greeted with something that can basically green slime, right, which can immediately kill any character, right? As they go down, green slime falls, you're turned into a green slime.
Right. And then, kind of the thing that is going to be generally something that kills you across the entire lower level is that there are numerous situations where there are intelligent foes who have, or intelligently arranged foes who have specific instructions and strategies for how they attack the party that can be murderous.
Oh my God, yes. The ghouls, the bugbears, the gnolls, the actual cultists, Lubosh, they're all very deadly.
One of the first encounters when you come down the stairs into the ruined basement below the moat house, a basement that for whatever reason is not full of water, even though it's in a marshy area, but we won't get into that. One of the first encounters they have is sort of in this old ruined jail cell area, and it's got zombies hiding in the cells. And zombies are pretty bad by themselves for first level characters. They're, potentially a fairly powerful undead, especially if you don't have a lot of clerical assistance. But to make it worse, they have this pattern where they attack you in a way that they try and trap you from escaping. And there's a lot of them. I think there's 12 zombies.
There are 12 zombies.
And that's a lot of zombies for a first level party.
And at least 4 of them will take multiple hits to take down.
It's a dangerous, difficult encounter, and it's by far not the only one like that on this level, especially when you get over to the back end and you have fights with the bosses. That will kill you unless you are very well prepared with lots of help.
One point I want to add to this very dangerous lower level of the dungeon is a lot of these things I think can be easily adjusted if you don't want to run a TPK murder machine meat grinder adventure without sort of getting rid of some of the fun lessons that players can learn, right? You can make the zombies incredibly slow. They're missing legs and things, and they only move 5 or 10 feet, and the players can run away if they want. You can make the intelligent monsters more willing to talk and parlay with the characters. You can reduce the number of ghouls, et cetera, et cetera. So it doesn't have to be a TPK if you don't want to, but as written, be aware it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And they do some of that. They, for instance, seed the idea that there are numerous groups of evil humanoids lurking down in this dungeon who are working for the big bad, again, trying to bring back their evil cult to ascendancy. And they go to the point of saying, well, this group of evil humanoids is kind of the favorites, so their morale is extremely high. But this other group of evil humanoids is kind of gets second-hand treatment, and so if you approach them by trying to bribe them or whatever, they're likely to just take money to leave. And that's a cool thing. I'm glad that Gygax was sort of thinking in that direction. Another good lesson learned, that you don't necessarily have to fight everything to the death, that it is possible to talk with monsters and every once in a while reason with them, or at least come up with some answer other than now we shall fight and take each other's stuff.
My favorite example of this in this lower level of encouraging and really giving your players opportunities that they may or may not take to do this kind of stuff is finding the storeroom full of the cultists' uniforms, cloaks with the flaming yellow eye. Now, as written, the module often punishes them for trying to disguise themselves as cultists, but this was in one of my run-throughs, players were like, oh my gosh, we could disguise ourselves as the bad people.
Right, absolutely. And, there's really nothing in the adventure that says that that's to be punished. I think.
Well, I was thinking of Lubash. If they don't make the sign that they'll have no way of knowing how to make, he will attack them anyway. I'm like, come on, fuck that. He's a dumb ogre.
Yeah. Right. That does kind of set them up for failure, but at the same time, hey, he's a dumb ogre. Maybe there is some way to sort of trick him into, oh, well, you don't know that the password's changed, dumb ogre, sort of a deal. Right. So, and then there are the big bad and his bodyguards, who, as written, are pretty much like, nope, they will never fall for anything that you try, so you must fight them. And that sucks. But even there, too, there may be ways that intelligent people can work their way around. For instance, you mentioned in the upper works that there's a front door and there's a back door. Well, there's actually a third way in. There's a secret escape tunnel out of the basement. And one imagines that really thorough and really careful adventurers might very well find that exit and make use of it as a dungeon entrance. And, that's sort of advanced play sort of stuff. But, I can imagine that being something that good players could exploit and, again, improve their survivability.
In one of my playthroughs, and this is, again, just a fun way that this module can turn out, many different ways. Players, through many tries and perseverance, killed all of these evil cultists who want nothing but chaos and destruction. In another one of my playthroughs, the players were very interested in Lareth because he's so damn hot. He is beautiful. And they wanted to parlay with him. And instead of destroying them, they were willing to, let him go in return. And he wanted something in return, which, of course, was planting an evil curse on our party's ranger and showing him visions of the dark god, which came up later in this particular campaign. But the big bad has some fun nuance, and I think is a great example of how to put nuance in your just, mustache twirling evil guy.
Oh, yes. Lareth is explicitly described as Lareth the Beautiful and probably counts as TSR's second ship.
Yes. My players ship themselves so hard with Lareth.
Yes, excellent. Well, that's as it should be. But Lareth is well protected with many dudes, some of whom are elite. And that last encounter with Lareth, who is higher level than any of the players are ever going to be, is really a meat grinder. And gosh, that's one of the challenges, even for experienced and prepared players and characters, that's going to be one of the challenges is how do we end this adventure without killing everyone? Because that last encounter is really bad.
It's super rough.
It can be done, but it's still really rough.
It's really rough. The bad guys are prepared. They're intelligent. They have a defensive position. Unless your players, even if you've leveled them up, right, to third or level or something, unless they come up with some kind of plan, this is a encounter that will not be conquered without mass death.
Yes, absolutely. I know that the senior intelligent group who knew the adventure had a plan involving smoking them out. Of course, they knew that they didn't have any captives or anyone else who would also die by the smoking out. And so, of course, this was a good idea. But, stuff like that, trying to figure out some way to give yourself an edge, that might be essential for a group to really figure out how to win walking away from this final encounter.
What else do we want to say about the lower level? It is very weird looking at it on a map.
Yeah. Which is par for the course for Gygax drawn labyrinths. He's a big has a great fondness of making weird shapes and even putting his own initials in the dungeon map just for fun. And so it is pretty crazy. It definitely gets away from the regular geometries of the upper works and gives you the sense that, man, whoever dug this stuff was insane, which, as it turns out, they probably were because of stuff we learn in the sequels. But nevertheless, it's freaky, and whoever maps this out is going to be like, wait, what? It does what?
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. There are some doors that have never made sense to me. But at the end of the day, there's a great villain down here, and there's a giant crawfish. What more could you want?
There is a giant crawfish, also spoiled on the front cover.
Yes, that's right.
And but yeah, that's actually one of my favorite encounters is that it's lurking in this subterranean well, and it has quite a bit of treasure down there, but it's under the water, and someone's going to find it by being grabbed by a huge claw, and man, that thing will kill you. So
this was another teachable moment for one of my groups, which I added a bunch of pole arms, just sort of like, we just keep, these are our crawfish poking pole arms, like in the hall outside. And the players are like, why are these here? And then, someone gets a claw to the ankle and they're like, oh, now we understand.
Yeah, that's your turn. I don't want to do it.
We've come to the end of the written module, unless there's other things you want to highlight. But I think there's still a couple of really important things to talk about.
For my part, what I would want to talk about is how this adventure ties into other stuff. There is, like I mentioned, a lot of kind of denouement material about at the conclusion of the adventure, here are some things that could happen. And there's going to be a sequel, and it's going to be awesome, where you encounter the Temple of Elemental Evil.
Which is just a fucking great name. It's good.
It's pretty good. And they did ultimately, years after they created this adventure, they did ultimately create the Temple of Elemental Evil as a sequel, which is one of the largest, just physically largest labyrinths of encounters that I've ever seen published. And, kind of the first mega dungeon in some ways.
And I do have to say, the first time I ran this, I was like, you know what? We're probably going to do this next. I'm going to start reading this. My players are still poking around Hommlet in the upper levels, but I'm going to get started reading this stuff. And for me, I'll be honest, I didn't care for it at all, and I let my adventure go in a completely different way.
Well, of course, and that is because it, like Village of Hommlet, is very much kind of this pure monster environment, and if you only have appetite for that in small to moderate doses, then that's a bit much. It delivered what it promised, which was kind of a follow-up of what the evil plot is and how they're going about it, and some plentiful more things to slay and stuff to take. It was as advertised on the tin. But the adventure really is a good tie-in to the rest of the Greyhawk lore. Not just other adventures, not just the world of Greyhawk setting itself, but they wound up using this as sort of a tie-in to future products. Certainly, they tied together the Temple of Elemental Evil with the two other big adventure campaign compilations, the Slaver series, and then the GDQ, the kind of Descent into the Depths of the Earth series, which theoretically, if you did all three of them, you could take characters from first level up to insanely high level. So they tied them all together with sort of this uniform mythology and world building around it. Subsequent versions of Dungeons and Dragons continued to use the Greyhawk setting and tied into it. When 3rd edition came out, one of the big tentpole products was Monty Cook's Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil, which sort of took the events of this adventure and extrapolated it a little bit into the future to see why things were the way they were. Why is the lower level of the moat house so crazy? Well, that kind of gets explained a little bit. And that is also a very worthwhile adventure to explain, because most of what Monty does is great. But anyway, this is the Temple of Elemental Evil stuff is so pure. It's so elementally just about adventuring and fighting monsters that it can serve as the overlay, or you can overlay upon it just about anything. And one example of that is a book, Elizabeth Moon's The Deed of Paksenarrion. It was a fantasy novel. And I started reading it when it came out, and got about halfway through it, and then something dawned on me, and I said, wait a second. And I realized that the action was set at the moat house at the Temple of Elemental Evil. And
holy shit.
Other than the names being changed, it was identical to that. And she's admitted to that. She said, yeah, absolutely. I took the Village of Hommlet and I filed the serial numbers off of it. And they had this entire adventuring thing where they go down underneath this ruined moat house and have a fight with a big bad evil cleric. And obviously that isn't all of Elizabeth Moon's story. There's a lot more to it than that, but you can take all kinds of narratives and overlay it on top of very simple, basic adventuring modules like this and turn it into just about anything you want.
Okay, let's get into some examples of this. So there's all these plot hooks. If you're running this, and if you're looking like, I know I want to run a starter module, but I know I want to connect it to a larger campaign. What are some examples of what you and I have done with this module after Moat House, after the dungeon? Do you want to go first, or shall I?
I'll do mine,
Okay.
or at least one of mine. One of the games that you actually played in was inspired by Monty Cook's Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil. When we first came out with Pathfinder and started playing that, I created Dawn of the Temple of Elemental Evil, which went the other direction. It went when the town of Hommlet is still subjected to the Temple of Elemental Evil's forces before they've been defeated by good, and then exploring what that did to the setting, and it went in very weird directions. But that was a lot of fun. That kind of had this larger mythology that I could use to hang a different narrative on, and it was a lot of fun.
It was absolutely one of my favorite campaigns of all time. Speaking of like larger plots, I forgot to mention this. Is this the first time that we dare not speak his name on this podcast, that the Chained Oblivion, who has become very popular in streaming series like Critical Role and stuff like that, was ever mentioned or hinted at?
So I'm not sure that it was ever even mentioned in this adventure. I think that was sort of added on in later versions, particularly once the sequel came out. And I think in the pure adventure itself.
Well, doesn't one of the evil traders have a scarab that says TZMY? Is that a reference to Tharizdun?
No, it was actually a reference to a very specific tool that they use in the sequel to get into the innermost sanctum, basically. So at that point, there was not a hint of connection to the Big T, but the adventure that started Tharizdun was written not too long after this. That I think. S4 Sojkanth, followed by the I forget what the Tharizdun Hidden Shrine adventure was, are all sort of related, and both happened in the early 80s when Gygax wrote those things. And so that mythology, I think, was never very far from Gygax's mind. And certainly there were these elemental evil shrines that he put in as early as the G series of modules, which were among the first TSR products. So for AD&D. So anyway, I don't think that stuff was ever very far from his mind, and he always had it in his head that he was going to do this kind of overarching mythology of bad stuff.
So I assume that was a reference to Tharizdun because I had read a little bit of the next module, but had missed the part about it being a key to something. For me, I thought this was my players wanted to be pirates. I set in one of my adventures, I set the Village of Hommlet on the coast, and they were like, we just want our own ship and we want to go loot and things. And so this, I continued the adventure on this way, in that the cult in the moat house was attempting to draw the chained oblivion to their planet and have him consume the world. And so that was Lareth's plan all along. And while the next couple adventures didn't tie directly into the cult, it came back to bite the players in a big way in the sort of third act of their campaign.
Interesting. Sounds like world-shaking stuff.
I think one of the last big things, and maybe there's a couple little things we want to talk about, and I know we've been going a long while, I want to quickly go over, if you're thinking about running this, I think there are, a quick list of major things that you might want to be aware of, that you don't have to change, but you should consider changing. I think this is, as we said, a great intro adventure for new players, but one of the things that I would recommend, and I think this depends on your dungeon mastering style, but for me this works really well, is to actually have a sub adventure that happens before most of the exploration of the village and the moat house. And I think if you want to do the least amount of effort as possible, Matt Colville's example of your, baby's first Dungeons and Dragons adventure can fit in the Village of Hommlet very, very well. If you are looking for your first 5 sessions of play, I would argue that you can't do better than, going to Matt Colville's series, running the game, looking up the very first adventure, having it take place in the Village of Hommlet. Goblins kidnap a child from Lara the blacksmith. The players go and rescue the child. It can be done in 1 session of play. And maybe those goblins are in fact working for Lareth. And then gives them the chance to just get started, because there is nothing in this adventure that screams, deal with me or do something. If you have incredibly brand new players, that can be maybe too challenging to overcome. If you're too nervous as a dungeon master of just having everything open and you want to get them started on, here is something to deal with. Combine those two and you've got a great intro adventure.
And, sort of to dovetail into that, one of the things that I think the adventure does that is fairly flawed is that there isn't a great transition between messing around in the town and then going to the moat house. So Obviously the moat house is some distance outside of town. At some point, they fool around in town, decide they're going to go there, and then they just go there. There really isn't any information on what else might be outside of town. There's certainly a lot of room left for there to be other adventuring locations, old ruins left behind from that last conflict, or lairs of monsters. There isn't even a random encounter table for what you come across when you wander the woods. There is random encounter tables for what's in the upper and lower works, but then there really isn't one for, hey, I'm wandering through the woods, I'm searching for the moat house, what do I encounter? So I think there's lots of room for a creative DM to prepare either some mobile encounters with creatures or monsters or something else that you come across out in the woods, or even some sort of lesser encounter area, such as your goblin lair, where people could go and adventure and say, there are things going on in this wilderness other than just the moat house.
Right. That hook of, or yes, it could be completely unrelated. Just something for brand new players to get them started. That's not, you're in a village. Well, what do you do? Right. That might not be the most appealing hook for people who have no idea what Dungeons and Dragons is. The other thing I think Dungeon Masters, this is a must, right? You need a table of random names. You need lots and lots of names, right? One of our rules is everyone people meet needs to have a name. Only a couple people have names. Get that random name table ready.
Yes, don't be like me and name every water elemental you come across Fluby. That just irritates the players.
You could name every fire elemental our beloved Bernie Sanders.
Yes, that was quite inventive of you, Matt. Thank you.
Let's see. Another couple points. This is a sausage fest. You want to probably gender swap a couple NPCs here.
Yeah, no, I would say that one of the things that Dungeons and Dragons and the early TSR era was worst at was being inclusive. And I think that is more than just gender. I think that feel free to add a modern and I think more appropriate sensibility to not just what happens in the village, but what happens down in the dungeon as well. And it would be great for us to have some more interest in both villains and allies that don't necessarily comply with cisgendered type divisions.
Excellent point. Yes. I think last but not least, this module has been around for a long time. There are a lot of online resources that you do a little poking around that can be very helpful that are not just this podcast. For example, some people have, and I'll see if I can find the link, mapped out the NPCs and their relationship with each other. That can be very helpful if you're running them. It was for me.
I think it can be helpful. I think having, like you say, your list of names potentially attached to some of the places in town is a great idea. Maybe having names for some of the bad guys in the dungeon, because it's entirely possible with things like sleep spell that some of these will be captured and questioned. And I think being a little bit prepared for those situations goes a long way, as far as, in any game that you run, you always want to create the illusion to your players that you have a completely fully formed game world in your head that you're just waiting to truck out every last detail of. It's not true. You don't actually have that most of the time, unless you're much more prepared than I am. But you want to at least give them the illusion and let them pretend to believe in the illusion that you have this fully fleshed out world, and anything you can do to preserve that is going to be helpful for them to enjoy your game.
I think I want to end on this final question, Andy, which is, how the fuck does every peasant in this town have the life savings of like a duke's ransom buried in their shitter? Every NPC has like 500 gold in gems or something like that.
In fact,
One of my favorite things.
there is a fun question mark way to play this adventure, which is that instead of playing heroes, you play ravening monsters who invade Hommlet and destroy it. And yeah, there's a lot of treasure there if you know how to find it. And so yeah, if you're a evil ogre smashing these huts apart, it could be quite fun for a certain sick type of individual.
I think for me, the answer is a mystery that you can answer as a dungeon master. That basically this town is, basically has a conspiracy that crosses faction lines. That they all discovered a part of the treasure during the battle, and they all agreed not to tell anyone. In the forces of good that came and saved their city.
Oh, yes. Very Three Kings. I like it.
Yes. Matt's quick tips for converting this to 5th edition. So this is a 1st edition module, and many I know of our listeners have exclusively played 5th edition, which is completely fine. What you will find in one of the major differences beyond the way in which the module is written is, the stats and magic items don't work. However, I'm going to argue that there's a couple quick things that you can do to kind of make this fit with the current edition of the game. One is there are plenty of monsters in this that have stat blocks that are already translated to 5th edition. Things like ogres, gnolls, giant spiders. They already have 5th edition stats, and if you have the monster manual or even the SRD, you will have all the stats you need to convert them. However, there are a lot of encounters in this game that have a lot of monsters that, if you convert them to 5th edition, will make your players have an even worse time than they would in the already slightly deadly original edition. I'm talking here about maybe the groups of zombies, bugbears, gnolls, and bandits. If you convert these straight to 5th edition, you're going to find your 1st, 2nd, or 3rd level players staring down a group of monsters that not only has an action economy advantage on them, meaning they can take more actions in a round than the player characters, which is something you really want to consider when you're talking about balance or challenge of an encounter. They also have a huge amount of hit points over the player characters. 5th edition in general, when converting things from 1st edition to another edition, has a lot more hit points for its NPCs and for its monsters. So, for example, a typical bandit in this has like 4 or 6 hit points. A bandit in 5th edition, if you take the average hit points, has like 11, right? And that's true for pretty much all of the monsters. What I will tell you is that for most of these encounters, I think your easiest bet that will save you time and, make the encounters more appropriate and while still challenging for your players is just to use the hit points published in the module. Now, this will mean that certain things, like some of the smaller frogs or the bandits in the upper moat house, will drop to a single sword, dagger blow, or cantrip from your player characters. And that's okay. That, in fact, makes it really fun, where your players are, really feeling like heroes as they drop some of these lesser foes with a single blow, while, some of the bigger monsters take 3 or 4 good whacks from the player characters. The other thing that you might want to consider stat-wise, mechanics-wise, when translating this from 1st edition to 5th edition is that the amount of loot, both in bullion and currency and in magic items, is considerably more than what is considered standard by the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide guidelines or most 5th edition published modules. There are 2 approaches you can take with this. One, which is a perfectly acceptable approach, is say, fuck it, give the players fun things. This is the approach I would take. This will mean, however, your player characters will emerge, if they survive this module, with a considerable much larger amount of loot in gold and magic items than most typical 5th edition characters of similar level, and that you will then have to, through the rest of the campaign, perhaps keep up that high level of magic items finding, because your players, there's enough +1 and +2 magic items for everyone to find something, plenty of scrolls and the like. The second approach is you might want to tone things down a little bit. And this can easily be done by kind of eliminating the most common offenders, which are the +1 and +2 items. Again, I generally say fuck it and let the players have it. But if you want to get rid of those, that goes a long way. The rest of the magic loot that the players are most commonly encountering are one-shot or consumable items, which can all be very helpful in dealing with some of the tough challenges, right? Some of the potion of undead control, and you're like, oh shit, there's no stats for that. Let the player turn undead as an evil cleric of 5th or 10th level or something like that. Can be really useful for solving encounters that might be very deadly. Others, like the Scroll of Stinking Cloud hidden under the crayfish, can be basically a godsend to players struggling to deal with the holdout of the cultists. As Andy said, they have to be, one way to deal with them is to smoke them out. Well, a Stinking Cloud will do that on steroids. So the last thing is, yes, some conversions need to be made. The good news is that there are stats for a lot of these things. The bad news is that because there are so many of them, for the larger encounters, you want to think about reducing the hit points of the monsters or reducing their numbers. For the magic items, you might want to consider reducing the number of magic items. For example, Fernakaford, and I think another character in this dungeon there are 2 rings of invisibility here, right? These are magic items that change the way a player can play the game if he or she or they get one of those magic items. So just something to consider if you're converting to 5th edition. Hey, if people are actually interested in a 5th edition conversion, please let me know. It's something I've half attempted that I have like in my own notes for my own playthrough. I've played through this twice in 5th edition, but it's a considerable amount of time. But if people are interested in getting a full 5th edition conversion to this module, let me know. And if people ask for it, I will probably do it. Okay, Andy, we have talked more than enough about T1, the Village of Hommlet. Any final closing thoughts? Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Just that I love this adventure. I think people would gain a lot by picking it up and reading it, even if you don't run it in its current form. Look for either the 79 printing with art by Trampier and maps by Dave Sutherland, or the 81 printing, which adds art by guys like Jeff D. And then, if you choose to go on to the 1985 sequel, then pretty much everyone in TSR's stable of artistry contributed art to that at one point or another. So if only for the art and the maps and some of the ideas that Gygax had, it's a great source book. I encourage you to find it, read it, and absorb it.
And please, listeners, if you have questions about the Village of Hommlet or anything else we discuss, send us an email at dmofnone@gmail.com. Please write and put in the subject line, "Attention, Andy, please complete and publish Dawn of the Temple of Elemental Evil. Please make Andy miserable by forcing him to do this through popular acclaim."
Yeah.
We're going to make it happen. He's saying no, but we're going to make it happen. All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Please stay safe out there and keep rolling them dice.
And the sun's setting fast, and just like they say, nothing good ever lasts. Well, go on now and kiss it goodbye, but hold on to your lover, 'cause your heart's bound to die. Go on now and say goodbye to our town, to our town. Can't you see the sunset? said and done.